I am the great-granddaughter of Joseph and Eliza Morgan. Joseph Morgan arrived here from England in 1857. His brother, John Henley Morgan, not sure here, he either arrived a few years ahead, a little earlier in the 1850s, or he arrived with Joseph Morgan. Those records are not entirely clear. Eliza Hamlin Furneaux arrived in 1858, a year later, and the story says Joseph's betrothed arrived in 1858. Her brother, William Furneaux, arrived in 1857. So she joined him, evidently already knew and was engaged to Joseph Morgan, and they married in 1860. Her brother, William Furneaux, married Fanny Jackson. And so the Jackson, Furneaux, and Morgan families form the nucleus of what's been referred to as the English colony in the Peters Colony. Peters Colony was this part of Carrollton. It encompassed a lot more than Carrollton, but W.S. Peters was the organizing force behind the Texas Land and Immigration Company. And he was born in England, but also lived in Kentucky. And he set up a committee of men, both from Kentucky and from England. And they really recruited. Their job was to recruit settlers to this part of the country. And their first office was in Carrollton, and it became known as Peters Colony. Their flyers promised eternal spring and fruit trees and wonderful climate. That first winter when it was sleeting and snowing, I don't think they thought too much of that. I've been to Devon. They came from Devon in England. And it is beautiful, rolling, green country, and we have wondered what possessed them to come. I think the Jacksons came because of the primogeniture. The first son gets the property. That family came in 1848. The two Morgan brothers came, I don't know why, because they were the two males, oldest males. They would have inherited any land that was in their family. William Furneaux was not the oldest son, so he probably came because there was land here and his brother was going to get the land in England. They lived in about a 15-mile triangle in Devon. Torquay was on the coast. Devon is the county to the southwest, just Cornwall's at the tip and then Devon, and Torquay's on the coast. And the Buckfast Lee is where the Furneauxs were from, and that's about 15 miles to the west. And the Jacksons were in a couple of villages, Leslie and Morton Hampstead, about 15 miles to the north. So they were in a very small area, probably knew each other, but I don't know what kind of contact they had before they got here. But they came directly from England to this area. The other part there are a lot of Illinois and Kentucky and people from that part that also came to the Peters Colony. They brought some English customs with them. The primogeniture, the first son getting the property, got carried over here. My grandfather didn't get the land, his older brother did. They named their houses, which I'll talk about a little bit, but they brought some of the names of their houses in England to this part of the country. And they arrived here in 1857, 1858. They were not particularly involved with the Civil War, and they weren't involved with the issues around that. Plus, my grandfather was very kindly toward the Negroes, as they were called in the 1850s, and they thought he was a Northern spy. Now, there are a lot of stories about this hanging story, but a lot of versions. But he was suspect, and the story that my grandfather wrote in 1935, the way he told it was that my great-grandfather, Joseph, was digging a well. Some Southern soldiers came and arrested him and were ready to string him up on a tree right then and there. One version says that the neighbors rallied round. Another says that he said, "Wait for the presiding elder from Cochran Chapel to come. He'll vouch for me." Maybe he was in the crowd. I don't know. But anyway, the friends and family vouched for him, and they left him alone, and the soldiers went away. And he survived, and so did. Thus I did. I wouldn't have been here if he had been hanged. Interesting sidelight, that presiding elder from Cochran Chapel was William Holmes Hughes. And I don't know, there are a lot of Hughes family in Carrollton area, and he was a part of that. And my grandfather became a Methodist minister in the area, and he writes in a letter of seeing his father and Uncle Buck, as this man was called, at a church meeting. So that was a long-time friendship. But with the threat of being hanged, both his wife and his family and friends said, "You better get back to England." And so they packed up, got rid of most stuff, took some stuff to New Orleans to sell, and headed back to England. This isn't really Carrollton history, but it's an interesting story that goes with part of the heritage here. My great-grandfather kept a journal of that trip. They left their place, their log cabin, which was at about Farm to Market 544 in Old Denton Road, is where he had that first cabin. And Joseph and his wife Eliza and their 3-year-old daughter and his wife's mother, who had been visiting them, and a few others, another Furneaux and some people to help drive the mules, left with 2 wagons, and they said an ambulance, which was a wagon to carry Miss Furneaux, who was evidently older and not well. She was older, she was not well. And so they left there on June 23rd, 1865, went to Shreveport, down the river to New Orleans, and booked passage on a ship. That took till the 1st of August. They got on the ship 1st of August, and then arrived in Liverpool in England on October 7th. So that was quite a journey. Unfortunately, Eliza's mother died en route, and she was buried at sea. They stayed in Torquay for a while. My great-grandfather worked in his father's nursery. He had worked with plants. And their 3-year-old was there. And then Eliza and Joseph had 2 sons, John Hamlin Morgan, born in 1868, and Joseph James Morgan, my grandfather, born in 1870. So shortly after that, they packed up again, came back to this area, and they built a house where that log cabin had been, and they named that Park Hill. And my grandfather and John Hamlin and Mariah, their 3 children, grew up in that house. And I think Joseph and Eliza stayed there most of their life because there are pictures of them with the adult children at that house near that Old Denton Road 544 intersection. The frame house that they built that replaced the log cabin was then later incorporated into the barn, and the son, John Hamlin's son, lived on that property, and his widow, Alta Morgan, died just in 2006. So they stayed on that property throughout. I don't know where the name Park Hill comes from, but that's what they named that house. I said the English named their houses. Joseph's wife, Eliza, had grown up, was born and grew up in a house in Buckfastleigh in Devon named Hapstead. It was a very old house, several hundred years old. She lived there, and then the family moved into the subsequent generations moved into another house. But that was named Hapstead. And so John Hamlin Morgan, who inherited the land, built this beautiful white columned house here in the area and named it Hapstead. And it was there until the mid-90s. It's gone now. I don't think I know none of the houses I know about are still surviving. But that one backed onto 121, about where the Colony, Main Street, 423 comes in, and then goes down to 544 again. His brother, John Henley Morgan, built a house a little further east on 544, and he called that house Tor Hill. This was his family home. And I have letters from cousins in England, the Henleys, and they lived on Tor Hill Road. Then the Furneaux family, there was Furneaux Cemetery at Rosemead and Cemetery Hill Road, and that was on the property, and we were just checking, trying to figure out the exact location of where the Furneaux house was. It was either east of the cemetery. The Furneaux Cemetery was on the Furneaux land, and they had the house was either near Peter's Colony and Josie, or it was further north of that area. But that was their farm, their ranch. Furneaux's had about 3,000 acres. It was cattle, and the Morgans had about 500 acres and started with cattle and then went more to farming. But they were generally, the Morgans were the farmers and the Furneauxs were the cattlemen. Furneaux. And that family came over at the time of the Norman French, from France, and the Morgans were an old English family. And the Morgan and Furneaux, as you can see, that Hamlins and all these names interconnect. And they had the woolen mills in Buckfast-Lee. And so that's where that name comes from. And the Furneaux family can trace it all the way back to France before 1066. I can't keep straight all of that, but I know that's been a long, long family there. Their house, the Furneaux house in Torquay, was called Harewood, but it was on a road called Crest Hill. So the Furneauxs called their house Hillcrest. So they clearly love their heritage there. My husband and I have been in two of the houses in Buckfast-Lee, and were able to be we weren't in Hapstead, but we saw that, and then in the Hapstead house here. We had photographs of the house, and they left those houses in 1850s. We went to the post office in Buckfast-Lee with pictures, asked if they knew if the houses were around, and they pointed us straight to them. They hadn't changed a bit in the 1850s. Well, those pictures I had were 1899, actually. John Hamlin lived in the big house. My mother remembers going there for Christmas holidays with all the cousins. Then John Hamlin Jr. Lived there on the Park Hill, the 544 and Old Denton Road. And last I heard, there is a John Hamlin V. So that name has continued. But they said part of that is what these people did. The John Hamlin did keep the farming and lived the land and took care of the land until his death, and his widow lived on that land until it was. It's now a housing development. You can't see a thing of it anymore, but it was farmland for a long time. And there are pictures in the Elm Fork Echoes of them with their farm equipment. Interesting thing I learned when I was looking at my grandfather's records. My grandfather, Joseph James Morgan, worked on the farm, was going to be a farmer with his brother, and at some point decided he wanted to go to college. He went to Southwestern in Georgetown, Texas, and then went to seminary at Vanderbilt. And he graduated from there in 1899. And a cousin and I were looking at records at Vanderbilt and turned up the fact that his brother, John Hamlin Morgan, had been at Vanderbilt 10 years prior studying manual training, which was blacksmithing and carpentry and drawing and all kinds of things. And I don't know what sent him to Vanderbilt, but I'm guessing my grandfather probably had that connection. That's why he ended up going to Vanderbilt. The families, none of the houses exist, and somebody driving around in Carrollton today probably doesn't see any of that, but they did leave a mark both through the street names and various things. That my grandfather's the oldest child in the family, Mariah, during the time they were back in England, she was quite intrigued with her uncle's just recent return from being a missionary in Africa. That instilled a interest in mission field, and she worked with missionary work for many years. She realized in Dallas there was not a YWCA branch for black women, for the Negroes, and she established a branch of the YWCA for black women. And eventually they named that for her. So the Mariah Morgan branch of the YWCA still exists today. She also was quite interested in women's activities, and she was in the first delegation of women seated at the General Conference of the Methodist Church South in 1922. So she left her mark that way. John Hamlin Morgan, as I said, farmed this area and was a part of this community for many years. And then my grandfather, as I said, went to Vanderbilt, came back, was a Methodist minister in Oak Lawn and Garland, and then president of a small Methodist school in Terrell, Wesley College, and then worked in Dallas for the American Bible Society. His brother, well, both of the brothers were involved in education from early on. Joseph started teaching the kids right away. His brother's wife, Margaret Oliver, was from Scotland, came over, moved to England, and then came over with the Furneaux family. And she had a school. It's known as Ms. Morgan's School. She taught all of Joseph's kids. My grandfather and his brother and sister all went there. All of John Henley's kids and lots of other children of that period. So that was education. Then John Henley Morgan's oldest son, Joe, they're all called Joe, Joseph or John. It's hard to keep them straight. Joe was a principal in Dallas schools and was superintendent of the Dallas County School District. His son, Charles Gill Morgan, was a physicist and a geologist and went to the South Pole with Admiral Byrd. So he made his mark there. And then another cousin of that, from that line, Mona Morgan, is well known in this area. Anybody who was in school in Carrollton before 1966 either had Mona Morgan for a teacher or knew of her. She was an interesting woman. She didn't write ordinary thank you notes. She always wrote in verse. And so she had published a small group of some of her poems, and there are a list of some of the people in the area at that time, because she would, instead of a thank you note, she'd write a little verse. Instead of a congratulatory note, she'd write a little verse, and they're, identified who they were written for and to. Her cousin, Helen Morgan, was a librarian in the Dallas schools. The Furneaux I don't think there is a street named for a Morgan in Carrollton, but there is a Furneaux Street. There is Furneaux Creek. There is Furneaux Cemetery, and there's Furneaux Elementary. And Bill and Lane Furneaux volunteered at the Furneaux Cemetery for quite some time. And Lane Furneaux was quite interested in herbs, and she got the children to grow an herb garden. And she also cultivated a strain of rosemary, the herb, that is hardy for this part of the country. And it's called Furneaux Hardy Rosemary, and I have some growing in my backyard. So that they live on in that way. Lane is still living. And Lane will still send rosemary to the annual meeting of the Furneaux Cemetery because she not only was interested in how you cooked with herbs, but what they meant. And rosemary means remembrance. So she would always send a basket of fresh rosemary to the annual meeting so people could put a sprig of rosemary on the grave of the people, their family members they were remembering. Jackson Street, I think, is just north of the library here. That's a part of that family. I don't know as much about the Jackson family, although we were distantly married in there, but I don't know that part as much. And then driving out here to talk to them about this interviewing, right after, I've been to the Perry Homestead and that museum, and there's Perry Avenue, and the next street over is Larner. Well, Larner was an early settler here and a relative of mine on the other side of the family. So there are a lot of streets and places that people could, if they knew what was behind, who was behind the names, would be interesting. They were preachers. They taught Sunday school. They taught school. They had to do everything. And so yes, they were. And what interests me is in England, these families were, I said, are just in about a little 15-mile triangle. Well, these houses of what was called the English colony, of Peter's colony, were all within 3 or 4 miles of each other. So they knew each other, and there were a lot more families involved than those, but those are the ones that I'm related to, and they were active in the settlement of the community. Now then, that's starting with log cabin days to the first houses. The downtown Carrollton probably didn't exist as that at that time. That would come later. Peter's Colony flyers told them how wonderful it was, and I'm supposing that the two brothers were wanting a new adventure, new land. As I said, it wasn't because they had an older brother who got the land in England. I don't know. That's been a question we've had, why they would leave there and come here, but they wanted to come here. They were sold by the flyers, the ads. Now Jackson came first, and he may have really encouraged them to been part of that, in addition to the ads for it. But the Peters Colony people were very forceful in their marketing, and the reports were glowing about the climate. And my great-grandfather mentions in this journal, when he's going back, it said it had been a rough few years getting settled, building the first structures. I mean, just survival was pretty difficult in those very early years. And so when he got on the ship, his first reports there was plenty of good food, Irish potatoes. He was so excited because he hadn't had the variety that he had longed for at home. So, but they came back. They went to England for that duration, and then they returned and stayed on the land. Joseph Morgan, the great-grandfather, did move into Dallas at some point because by the time my grandfather married, his parents were living in Dallas near where Baylor Hospital is today. But there's a picture just a year or so before that marriage at the Park Hill house. They were still there, and he refers in letters to going out to see Papa and coming out here. So that was, they were still coming out here in early part of the 1900s. The journal is fascinating in talking about, they had these wagons and mules, and they started out and, made it all the way to Plano. and getting, stuck in the mud and getting something they had to send back to the farm to get something fixed on the wagon that broke down. And that was a pretty rugged journey. And I said it took them from end of June to 1st of August to make it to New Orleans. And so that was difficult. My grandfather, in telling about stories about his older sister, he wrote about one time when they were supposed to, his parents for some reason hadn't gotten back home in time for them to go to church, and big sister decided they were supposed to go to church, and she got out and got a halter on one of the horses and got her brothers on that and got them to church on time. And she was clearly a strong-willed gal. My grandfather also used to talk about taking the pigs to market. So they had pigs, and this is from this area, and he told about going down Turtle Creek to the market, and it would be an all-day trip, herding those pigs downtown. So, and he was going to. I don't know. He says in a story or paper about himself that he was just planning to stay on the farm with his brother and be a farmer, and then decided to go to school. He was going to go to school just for a year and then back on the farm. But then he got interested and went to college and became a minister. Mother loved to tell about, they would sometimes ride in a horse and buggy out to, from the house in Dallas, where my mother lived, to, for holidays, out to Uncle Ham and Aunt Etta's, the big white columned house. And the kids would all get up. There was evidently a stairway that went up to a third floor balcony or attic or something, and the kids had all kinds of games that they would play on the stairway up and down, and she had fond memories of coming out there. I don't remember her saying what they ate or anything else they did, but it was the ride out and then playing with all these cousins, which descend from these two brothers who came to Texas. The journal was interesting because they did talk about, stopping at night for food, and they had put in provisions. Another thing I'm not real clear on in family history is that the first day Joseph and Eliza and that group were moving toward New Orleans, and he says, as agreed, John Henley came for one more goodbye. So the brother rides up on his horse, and they have one more goodbye, and he says how hard that is, and he goes back, and then to the farm, and then one of them, they also had some other people helping to herd these mules and wagons besides Joseph, and the brother must have come back to England at some point as well, because one or two of his children are born in England, and about the same age as my grandfather. So I don't know when he returned to England and how long he stayed, but they were all, by the 1870s, they were all back on the farm. When I first came here and began exploring, I could go out to the Hapstead house, and there was a lot of empty land around. First time I found the Furneaux Cemetery, we were exploring. My parents lived in Denton. We would take back roads often between Dallas and this is in the 60s, 70s. This is not old history, but there was still a lot of empty land. And so we were coming along from the north, coming back from Denton, and came past the old Hebron Baptist Church, which did not have a 6-lane road running past it. It was a little 2-lane road, And then there was a lot of open fields all around, and we stopped and asked somebody where the Furneaux Cemetery was, and they gave us directions. And so we were going down these farm roads and went over a hill, and suddenly there were stockade fences, paved alleys, the whole development, and Furneaux Cemetery was in the middle of that. So it was beginning to get grown up then. Now, Peters Colony includes a lot more than Carrollton. It goes to the Red River, it goes down south of here, and then there were later bits that went west of here. So it's much larger than the Carrollton area, but this was their first office, and the first one settled here, and that group from England came here. There were others besides those three families, but those are the ones that I'm most aware of, that I know about. But there was quite the English colony, and they thought they were a little different. And in 1899, my grandfather took his bride back to meet the family. He was a poor Methodist preacher, but that's what you were supposed to do. And they took photographs, and that's how come I had the pictures of those houses in 1899. And at that time, they were owned by the county. The Furneaux house was a retirement home. The Hamlin house was a remand home. That's where they put little boys who were in some trouble. And they actually invited us into that house. So I got to go inside, and here is this tall, stately home with elaborate things on the designs on the ceiling, marble columns, and these little boys lined up in metal cots. and they were there. And Eliza grew up in that kind of surrounding and came to a log cabin. I used to see the John Neely Bryan cabin down when it was downtown, and I'd seen the houses in Buckfast Lee. I think she went from that to adjusting to living in a little small cabin. They finally built a larger house, but they stayed here. Joseph and Eliza and John Hamlin and Etta Bean are all buried in Furneaux Cemetery, as is William Furneaux. Again, the English connection. That big, tall monument in Furneaux Cemetery, I'm sure, was shipped over from England. It's a very English-style monument.